Now we had a look at single field and compound indexes and what we can do with them and how we can measure the efficiency. All super important things. Now let me introduce two new types of indexes. And the first one is the so-called multi-key index. For this, I made sure that I dropped my contacts collection, so that huge collection which we imported before. I already did drop it, hence I see false here. And now I will add a new value here. Contacts, insert 1, and that new value, mi, and here I will add hobbies, which happens to be an array of strings. Let's say cooking, sports. I'll also add another array, addresses. Let's say I have multiple ones. This will be an array, and each array is a document there, so embedded documents in an array. There, to keep it short and simple, I'll just have the street, main street, add another document with the street, let's say 2nd Street. Doesn't really matter. If I hit enter here, let's quickly have a look at what I inserted. This is looking good. I got max, 2 hobbies, which are just strings, and 2 addresses, which are documents. Now let's index an array, because that is possible in MongoDB too. For this, I'll of course create an index again, as we did it before, and this time I will index hobbies. And if you remember, hobbies was an array, right? We see it here, it was an array of strings. Let's hit enter, and this works. Now let's try using that. And first of all, let's execute a query where I look for hobbies being equal to sports. And I do find something. I can print that to make it easier to read. I do find max, of course, because I do have sports in there. Now, the interesting thing is, if I explain this with execution stats, I see that the winning plan was an index scan, and we see that there is multi-key is set to true for my hobbies index. MongoDB treats this as a multi-key index because it is an index on an array of values. And technically, multi-key indexes are working like normal indexes, but they are stored a bit differently. What MongoDB does is it pulls out all the values in your index key, so in hobbies in my case here. So it pulls out all the values in the array I stored in there and stores them as separate elements in an index. This, of course, means that multi-key indexes for a lot of documents are bigger than single field indexes. Because if every document has an array with, let's say, 4 values on average, and you have 1,000 documents, and that array field is what you index, you would store 4,000 elements, because 4 times 1,000. So this is something to keep in mind. Multi-key indexes are possible, but typically are also bigger. Doesn't mean you shouldn't use them. If you typically query for an array and the value in an array, well, then it makes sense to turn this array into a multi-key index. That is perfectly fine. So now we learned that we can use a multi-key index, and we are using one on hobbies. Now let's also add one on addresses. Contacts, create index, and there I'll index addresses 1. Now this also worked. It created that index. And now let's try to utilize that. Let's reach out to contacts and let's explain what's happening with execution stats so that we can see if that index gets used. And let's find all addresses where the street is Main Street. If I hit enter here, we see it actually used a collection scan and not our index. The reason for that is that our index, of course, holds the whole documents and not the fields of the documents. So MongoDB does not go so far to pull out the elements of an array and then pull out all field values of a nested document that array might hold. So our index would only get used if I were not looking for the street in the addresses I have in that array, but if I were looking for addresses holding some document. So if I were looking for addresses where street is Main Street. if I were looking for that, you see it would have used an index scan because it is the whole document which is in our index in the end. MongoDB pulls out the elements of the array. For addresses, a single element in the array happens to be a document, so that document is what MongoDB pulled out and what MongoDB then stored in the index registry. And therefore, this is something to be aware. What you can do, though, is you can create an index on addresses.street. This also will be a multi-key index. As you can see, if I now repeat my earlier query where I was looking for addresses street, if I repeat that query now you see it uses an index scan for this, and it is a multi-key index. So you can also use an index on a field in an embedded document which is part of an array with that multi-key feature. You should just be aware that, of course, using multi-key features on a single collection will quickly lead to some performance issues with writes, because for every new document you add, all these multi-key indexes have to be updated. And if you add a new document with 10 values in that array, which you happen to store in a multi-key index, then these 10 new entries need to be added to the index registry. And if you then have 4 or 5 of these multi-key indexes per document, well, then you quickly are in a low performance world. Still, multi-key indexes super helpful if you have queries that regularly target array values or even nested values or values in an embedded document in arrays. There are a couple of restrictions, or one important restriction to be precise, when using multi-key indexes, and that is that if you add index, a multi-key index, and you add it as part of a compound index, that is generally possible. I can add name in ascending order, and name is not an array, it's just a single field. And I can then add hobbies like this. This works. However, what won't work is that I say I want to have a compound index made up of 2 or more multi-key indexes. So addresses 1 and hobbies 1 will not work because you can't index parallel arrays. The reason for that is simple. MongoDB would have to store the Cartesian product of the values of both indexes, of both arrays. So it would have to pull out all the addresses, and for every address, it would have to store all the hobbies. So if you have 2 addresses and 5 hobbies, you already have to store 10 values. And that, of course, becomes even worse the more values you have in addresses. So that is why this is not possible. Compound indexes with multi-key indexes are possible, as you see here, but only with one multi-key index, so with one array, not with multiple arrays. You can have multiple multi-key indexes, as you can see here, in separate indexes, but in one and the same index, only one array can be included.